Welcome to the Node.js and Oracle Database Office Hours, February 2020. Standard safe harbor, we're in the open source space, so things are very subject to change. Don't make any purchasing decisions on things we say. So on the call, we have myself in the middle, Christopher Jones, product manager in the data access group. So I look after some of the back-end legal customer relation stuff for database drivers. Anthony Tuaninga, one of the key people here in our driver space, is online. He's actually the creator and maintainer of the Python driver and now does a whole heap with the Node-Oracle database driver and various other projects here in the data access space. And Blaine Carter, who's our evangelist in the space, and as you could just hear from some of that chat, looks after a lot of the back-end systems and making sure we reach out to you in the community, goes around to conferences and presents and user groups. So if you've got a user group you want him to come along to, or myself or even Anthony, depending where you're located, just let us know or let him know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Node-oracledb 4.2, which was released relatively recently. I have some sort of slideware demos, etc., on some of these features, and the rest I'm going to just talk through quickly. The main one is this finer grained bind type. So before we go too far, I'll just say that your scripts are still going to work. There's no issues with you just maintaining what you're doing now, but we just added some features here. So we talk about changes, but it's really additions to the bind type system. Along with that, kind of correlated with that, with some changes in the nchar, nvarchar, and nclob for people using the national character set. You may remember that the database actually has two character sets. It has the standard character set, and then it has something called a national character set, which is only used when you create one of these three types. And then to throw into the mix, you've got the client character set, and then you've got the Node-oracledb character set, which luckily both of those two are UTF-8, Oracle's variant of that. And so one thing that we've done there in terms of nvarchar is make sure that they're actually fetched without potential data loss in terms of character set conversion between all of those four that I just mentioned. Nclob, you can now create temporary nclob. So basically all of these things now work. You can bind, query all of these national characters. Continuous query notification has something called client-initiated connections. I don't have demos on that, but that is a kind of convenient way for using continuous query notification, way of getting events into your application when something changes in the database, in the database table. Client-initiated basically means that the networking is a lot easier to do. It's one extra flag when you subscribe for a CQN notification, and that can be extremely useful. LastRowid I'll talk about a little bit later. And the one other thing which I don't have demos on, not really needed, is this updated doc and examples for lob streaming. So most of you are probably fetching lobs directly as strings or buffers, so this doesn't affect you. But for anybody who is actually streaming larger data values using this lob, capital LOB, the class which is part of Node-oracledb, the close method on the lobs, we're kind of deprecating. That was something which we'd invented. It's really Node-oracledb specific. In the meantime, since we'd invented that, Node itself had come along and invented a destroy method, which has better functionality, and that's what you should be migrating to. Anthony looked at close the way we'd done it, and we're doing something which is now technically not correct in terms of issuing events when you call the close method. So it's probably better not to use that if you don't have to. Just move across to the standard destroy method, which is part of the Node.js stream interface, which then is inherited by the lob class. So those are the major things. I will remind me to pop up the changelog later, and we can go through some of the minor things as well. So I want to talk about this binding changes. So just as a background, most of you know, but it's always worth repeating, that binding associates data with placeholders. So it always keeps the data separate from the SQL or PL SQL statements. So you can see the kind of two examples there with things we call inbinds and outbinds, depending on where data is being transferred to. For an inbind, your application on the left is sending across a SQL string, and it's got a bind variable column BV, and it's also, the application is also sending back some data and saying, hey, this is a character type. This is just one of the examples. Obviously, we have dates, numbers, all sorts of other funky things there. You can be calling PL SQL. Basically, it's passing data. Inbind is passing data from the application into the database. And then, yes, maybe a little confusing because there's a select which is getting data back out. But in terms of the bind itself, you're passing that bind value into the database. And the key thing here is that the application doesn't know what the data is on the database side. If you're doing a bind for a PL SQL block, parameters, they have types. Node-oracledb doesn't know that type. It's just sending data and saying, I want it to be treated as a particular type. And the database does whatever it needs to do on the conversion. Kind of similarly for outbinds, basically when you're getting data out of the database, you just say, hey, I've got some space, and okay, there's some lots of complexities about whether it's dynamically allocated or pre-allocated and what have you. But basically you're saying, give me 10 bytes, excuse the typo there, and I want it to be returned to me as this character data type. And that's kind of all good and fine and works kind of nicely. And we have that bind type. If you look at the bind block here in the middle, and you specify one of these types. So in previous versions of Node-oracledb, we've kept this type system for these type values related to the JavaScript types. You had one of these blob or club, I mentioned our lob class types in Node-oracledb, or you had a standard JavaScript buffer, date, number, string. Those are the constants we use. These are just numeric constants that we used for the type value when you're doing the bind. And for inbinds, we would infer, we'd assume, we'd use a type based on this data. This is obviously a string, so internally it would be the same as if you'd specified type oracledb string in this case. When you're doing an outbind, there's no way we can tell what you want. We've just got empty memory space, so you actually physically have to specify the type. Now, this works pretty well. There are some little quirky things here. One is, the major one, I guess, is this nvarchar, the national character set. You've got a string, but because of just the way it is, quote unquote, things we can't really control in terms of that mapping which happens at the database end, there's no real good way to specify there is no way for whether or not that data is going to be mapped into a standard varchar column, for example, or an nvarchar column. We need to actually specify one extra little bit of type information. So even specifying it as string here isn't enough information. So we need to actually expand the type system somehow. We need to actually add an extra flag to say, hey, this really is an nvarchar if I'm passing a string in, or we need to actually just change this constant, and we kind of chose that latter method. So as I mentioned, nothing has particularly changed. You can still use all of these constants. You may actually prefer to use these constants, but now we've actually expanded into this DB type constants. And you may remember back in about the 4.0 days, we actually did some renumbering of the constants just to make sure that the mapping worked better between these things, and they were interchangeable in the appropriate places. One other thing I should call out is a thank you to one of our contributors, Diego, who's actually contributed the code for binding this Boolean types, which you use in PL SQL context. I happened to be doing that just as we were doing the rest of the binding, so it worked out really nicely for us. Let's have a quick look at documentation. So this is all, we're talking about execute binds. This is not queries, this is the bind itself. We obviously have the options for the bind parameters, and if we look at the types, you can now see there's a whole new section in the manual speaking about the mapping between types. Let me just talk through this table a little bit. So the first thing you can see that these two constant values or constants actually map to the same value, and similarly for some of these others, so you can use them interchangeably. And the way to read this table is, if you're dealing with a string or want to deal with a string, if you're doing an outbind, and your database type is a varchar2, then you would bind as one of these. The way to read this is that if you are binding as a string, then regardless of what the database type is, then one of these two is going to be the type that we bind as, and the database is going to do its mapping between this type and this data into whatever the database type is, which may be one of these multiple things. So that's just a slight confusion there when I was reading it last night. Let me go through it again. So these constants are the default type for this Node.js type, regardless of whatever the database type is. Oracle has quite a big mapping. We tried for a long time to try and simplify this, keep it simple as I showed you, just using the JavaScript types. But unfortunately now we've had to expand a little bit more. You can see that we've now got new types. So some of these combinations are now supported. Previously you would just use a number bind type, and that would kind of work well in most cases, but there may be specialist cases where you want to bind these things directly. Dates in particular, there was what I would call an optimizer bug. We think it's fixed now, where the default type that we were binding for any of the date so that we were passing in was this oracledb.date type. And that would then map your date into any of these database types. Again, so if you're dealing with a date, we're dealing with a date in JavaScript land, you would be binding as oracledb date, and then Oracle do its magic to map this date into any of these particular database types. If you're calling a PL SQL function which has been overloaded, so it has similar signatures but different data types, sometimes that mapping wouldn't work perhaps as you wanted. It might pick up the wrong overloaded function because the binding would assume that it was a particular type and it wouldn't match the actual type that you'd intended it to match and call the exact procedure that you wanted it to call. Kind of subtleties here. If you don't care about these things, just continue using these simple types. Things will work mostly. If you start caring, if you start seeing problems with maybe an optimizer not doing something correct because it's not having to do a conversion between types all the time and therefore slowing down the query, you might want to look at whether you should be binding as one of these more granular data type binds. And the rest is up there. I'll let you read that. So that's really binding in a nutshell. Let me go into lastRowid. I think I have some examples of that. So this is an example which I'll push. Actually, it'll come out into GitHub soon. It's not, for some reason, didn't push it out with 4.2 release. We now have this extra attribute here of the result from execute. And as you can guess, it's the kind of last row ID of what we're inserted or performed with DML on. So obviously when you're inserting, you insert one row and you get the new row ID back. So what this means is you no longer need to add that returning into with a bind variable clause. You don't need to actually start appending SQL statements, which you might have had to do in the past. That always introduce issues with string concatenation and variance between our database version and our database and other vendors' databases. This is much cleaner and much easier to use. The quirk comes down here. So I'm doing an update, and by now I've got 2 rows into the table. And we're just basically updating all of the rows. You can see here that 2 rows are updated on the right-hand side. We only get 1 row ID back, and it's a little unpredictable which one you're going to get back. It's the last row ID which was impacted by the update. It's just the way it works. In this case, you might want to use something like the returning into clause if you really care about multiple rows. But for simple inserts, this is going to be really useful to use. Whoops, what else? Miscellaneous news. Actually, I was going to go through the changelog, but let me do miscellaneous news. For those who are following my blog series, I had a blog post out there using Docker and Node-oracledb and Python. I finally got the part 2 of that published, and that's out there if you want to check that out. And the big sort of heads up alert, let us know your feedback ASAP, is that we are starting work on Node-oracledb, the next version, and we're doing a refactor of the JavaScript layer. Currently it uses, or if you look at the 4.2 code, it uses the callback method, moving that into the async await style just to make it a lot cleaner and easier for us to extend, easier for us to use and you to read and contribute. But as part of that, because this is changing effectively to using promises natively, we're kind of being forced to remove custom promise library support. Obviously, you can use native promises. Probably most of you are doing that. But we need your feedback. There's some sort of hacky things which could be done. We don't really want to have to do them. You can do your own wrapping if you do want to use them, but it means that the upgrade path isn't going to be drop-in for people using promises, hence why we're bumping the version to a 5, even though the number of other changes are not hugely going to be significant just based on our standard time to get release, and I don't know, we'll be looking at release mid-year or something like that. So that's the kind of update of what's happening. Please let us know ASAP what you think about this removal of custom promise support. Obviously, you can continue using a version 4 Node-oracledb, or just swap over to native promises if that's fine for you to continue with. And I was going to look at the changelog. Let me just go into all of my bookmarks just to finish up with the 4.2 theme. So here's the changelog. We spoke about the binding. I spoke about enclobs, enclob supported, client-initiated connections. Anthony put in a bug fix there. Somebody had reported if you're using execute many, then we had a wraparound pretty early. Now the number of bits allocated for that offset is increased. Enclobs I spoke about. A little subtlety here from pool sharding, just the way it behaves in terms of the pool and our interaction with the JavaScript layer and the C layer beneath that. So we've put in a little tweak here for people using sharding, just to make sure that your get connection requests don't just hang there waiting for somebody to free up something in the pool, but actually does respect the queue timeout. The Webpack one is interesting. We do see people using Webpack, and basically to use Webpack with Node-oracledb, you had to do all this sort of hacking around because the library load path between the JavaScript layer and loading the C binary, the module, which we contribute to, seems to work differently in Webpack. And I don't fully understand it because I don't have resources to just go and play with all of this stuff all the time. Just really appreciate the community contributing. Basically, you had to move the binary module from one place to another and then change the way the loader was actually working. One thing we did was we just added a few extra paths into the way we search and the places we search, just to make it a little easier. So your modules should be a little bit smaller nowadays. Let us know how that goes. As I say, I haven't tested it myself. Just waiting on customer feedback, user feedback for that. So that's it from me. 20 minutes of fast-paced talking. Overview of 4.2 and that note about what's coming up in 5 that we want some feedback on. Kind of open for questions if anybody has questions. Otherwise, we will just call it a day. And we've got a raised hand. And what does that raised hand mean? Does it mean you're typing? Or would you like to talk? Let me allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself, Niels, if you want.
Okay. I've taken a look at the different types for the parameter, for the bindings. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the XML type, it will always find a string.
Yeah, that's binding of XML is always problematic. Dealing with XML has been problematic because it's, how do I put this? It's really been focused in my mind at people doing things within SQL and PL SQL, and it was never fully exposed through the C layer of the API. So we have some limited access to XML. Okay. And that also, therefore, impacts the size limits, because obviously strings are limited. Yeah. So we're kind of stuck with that. But Anthony, do you have comments?
Just to mention that you can convert it to a CLOB and then, of course, do what you need to do with it.
Okay.
Yeah. Doing it as string works, but it's limited to 32K.
So effectively, in your queries, you have, or interfaces, you have to declare things as CLOBs or use the toClob method, and then you're happy. So it's not quite as direct as we'd like, but I say that that was just that limitation in the C layer. I have raised it a number of times, but things move on. People are now looking at JSON and all sorts of things. As we had the JSON data type come into 12C, whatever version of 12 it was. So things are kind of progressing more along there. But we can pass that on. And certainly anybody you speak to in Oracle, just mention it to them just to raise its profile a little bit. What are you trying to do with XML? Are you writing new systems or interfacing with existing systems?
No, I haven't. Only tried it a little bit with Node.js. But I was a little bit astonished that it's not a lob as standard, but limited to the varchar 2 size.
Yeah, apologies for that, but that's the way it is. Any other questions? Anything else you want to chat about or let us know we should talk about next month? Sorry, next 2 months. I guess we'll be doing this every second month this year. Well, let's leave it there. Thank you for the questions, and we will talk in a couple of months. Bye-bye.
See ya.
See ya.